Good afternoon, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, Cutter Numbers and Shelf Listing for LC Classification. I'm Eva Sorrell, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Bobby Bothmann. Bobby is Metadata and Emerging Technologies Librarian at Minnesota State University, Mankato, and teaches cataloging courses for the iSchool at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Bobby is a member of the Cataloging and Classification Quarterly Editorial Board and an Americas Regional Council delegate to the OCLC Global Council. His presentation today will define shelf listing and the use and construction of cutter numbers for the application of the Library of Congress classification system. A few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. Today's webinar does not have interactive chat capabilities. If you wish to comment on today's presentation using Twitter, you may use the hashtag you see on the screen. We will not be monitoring the Twitter feed. If you have questions for Bobby, please type them into the question box on your screen, and he will answer them as time permits at the end of his presentation. Questions which remain unanswered while we are on the air will be answered offline and the answers sent to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording, the presentation slides, and an evaluation within 2 days. Now, there may be a slight delay as I turn the presentation over to Bobby.
All right. Good day, everybody. Thank you, Eva. So my name's Bobby Bothmann, as Eva said, and we're going to talk about cutter numbers for shelf listing and the LC classification schedules. There we go. So here I am, and Mankato, most people don't remember where it is, but almost everybody has seen or knows of Little House on the Prairie, and Mankato is the big bad city in the television program. So that's where I am, right down there in south central Minnesota, where it's a balmy 10 degrees, I believe, at the moment. So some tools that you will find handy for working with LC classification include the Library of Congress classification schedules themselves. So the old red books, no, they weren't red books, that's ALCTS. The old schedules that would fill up a bookcase are no longer printed anymore. So they are available as PDF files, and you've got the link to that right here. If you have a subscription to Classification Web, then you also have access to the full schedule set in that product. The Library of Congress Classification and Shelf Listing Manual, otherwise referred to as the CSM, is also freely available, and that's the instruction manual for making use of the Library of Congress classification. So that's something that you would want to bookmark and refer to as you have questions. There are also two really good books out. One is Van de Broughton's Essential Classification. It's in its 2nd edition, just a couple of years ago now, and a really good overview of classification generally, what the principles are, why we do it, how to do classification easily, and it spends 2 chapters each on LC, Dewey, and Universal Decimal System. So you get an overview of a variety of classification systems from that book. And then hot off the press here, late last year, is Dr. Karen Snow's A Practical Guide to Library of Congress Classification. So a really excellent, accessible book that you can make use of in pretty much any setting. So I highly recommend that one. So some conventions here. CSM, again, is the abbreviation or acronym for Classification and Shelf Listing Manual. LC, of course, for Library of Congress, and LCC for Library of Congress Classification. LCSH is the acronym for the Library of Congress subject headings, and then SH is just short for subject headings. So our learning outcomes today, we're going to learn how cutter numbers are constructed, identify when to use the cutter table or to adjust a cutter to fit in the existing shelf list, identify reserved cutter numbers, understand when to use predefined cutter numbers, and understand when to adjust constructed cutters with respect to the reserved cutter numbers. So that'll come more toward the end of our presentation here. And then you'll notice in the lower right corner there are slide numbers. So as you have questions, post those in the chat. If it's referencing a specific slide, if you could mention that slide number, that will be very helpful in answering the questions. So a little bit of history of the cutter number. So cutter is an eponymous term that we are given to this number that we use from Charles A. Cutter, who is the creator of the expansive, I think he actually called it Cutter Expansive Classification. It was developed in the 1890s. It was his second or third classification system. So the 1890s was full of people making classification systems and oohing and awing over them. So Cutter was oohing and awing over the Dewey system, and that inspired him to create this one. So it wasn't so much a competition as that different libraries just made their own classification systems. So this universal one or two class systems that we use in today's world is more a mechanism of or outcome of Library of Congress catalog cards being used throughout the various libraries. So his goal was to make his expansive classification system simpler than his original one, something that could apply to libraries of different sizes. So he has in his expansive classification definitions and scopes for small libraries, medium libraries, and large libraries, and different ways to make use of his class system based on those sizes. And the expansive classification that he developed was the basis for the Library of Congress classification system that many of us use today in academic and large public libraries. So Cutter was the one who introduced 4 different concepts for bookmarks. So this was something that would be used to approximate or create an exact alphabetical order when arranging books on a shelf. And 2 of these 4 concepts included the approximate and the exact alphabetic order. So an approximate alphabetic order would be using the first 3 letters of the author's last name or the title, depending upon which one you need to use, and ordering them that way. So as you can imagine, as you get bigger and bigger sets of books under one class number, the alphabetical order may not be quite right. So he said that this system worked well, the approximate system worked well for works that had up to 50 titles in a given class number. And if you had more than 50 titles in a given class number, then the exact alphabetical order would work best for that. And to make an exact alphabetical order, you need some flexibility. And this is where his Cutter table comes in. And so his Cutter table, as you can see here, here's a snippet from the top of his alphabetic order table, and I love the way that he spells alphabetic. And this is the table as altered by Kate Sanborn. So you may have heard of the Cutter Sanborn tables. That's what this is referring to, is the Cutter's tables as altered by Kate Sanborn. And I just thought this might be a nice picture for you to see what this looks like. I have no idea how they actually made use of it. I've never used a Cutter Sanborn table, so I am completely unaware of how this worked. I'm sure it's much simpler than the scary vision we have right there with that. So let's talk a little bit about alphabetical shelf order. So when we arrange things on the shelf, how we arrange them is an important consideration. Are we arranging by author? Are we arranging by title? Are we arranging by main entry, which in RDA is now called the preferred access point? So these are considerations that come up when looking at how to arrange things on the shelf. We also have this need to have each call number be unique. And that way it has its own special place on the shelf. So as you can imagine, if we're looking at the picture here on the right, if two of these books had the same exact call number, then it doesn't create uniqueness there. And so that would cause a little bit of confusion for the user as to which one they're supposed to pull off the shelf if they're different works. And this uniqueness is something that we achieve through the use of what is called a bookmark or a shelf mark, and what we now just seem to call most of the time a cutter number. So LCC, it technically is called a book number, but we usually call it a cutter number because we use the cutter number table from the Classification and Shelflisting Manual. And there are these book numbers or cutter numbers are constructed by us, by catalogers or classifiers, however you want to name yourself. And the purpose is to make it fit into the shelf list or to follow the cutter table. So we start out with either can it fit into the shelf list, or can we use the cutter table to create something? So I've mentioned this thing shelf list a couple of times, so let's define that more accurately here. A shelf list, very simply, is what you have in your catalog in call number order. That equates to the shelf list. So if you walk out into your stacks and you look at everything arranged in that order on the shelf, that's your shelf list. So really all you're doing is you're looking at the call numbers that have been used to create that shelf list. Many of us have multiple collections, so we will have call numbers in other collections that we won't see in a particular physical space on the shelf, and so that's why we tend to use a virtual shelf list these days. In olden times, maybe we would have used the it's still referred to as a shelf list, and it would just be the card catalog. They would have everything arranged in call number order so that you can go through and pick through those cards and find a spot where something might fit. So it's the same type of thing. And the shelf list is something that you, the library, define. So you may define the shelf list as what you have in your library. You may define it as what you have in your consortium, or in a whole set of public and branch libraries together. It may be everything in your state, if you have a state catalog that you can look at, or you might want to refer to the Library of Congress catalog itself and base your shelf listing decisions off of that. So the choice is yours. The key is to make a decision and make your use of whatever choice you have be consistent. So you don't want to use LC one day and then your catalog the next and then someone else's the day after. That is not going to work well for you. So a shelf list then, as you can see, relies really on having very unique call numbers. If you have a conflict, it's not the end of the world. You can fix that pretty easily by just adjusting your cutter number. The way that we make an LC call number unique is by the cutter number itself. So we've got three pieces of information that we put into an LC call number, the first being the class number. And in the mark format, that would be in the 050 subfield A. And then what the mark format calls the book number or the item number in subfield B consists of a cutter and the publication date for most books and monographic types of resources. There are some variations here and there, but the standard would be a class number in subfield A and then a cutter with a date of publication in subfield B. So if we look at our example here that we have F614.G66, that's our class number, and you can see that the class number actually has a cutter number in it, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here. So the cutter number that we're using to arrange things in alphabetical order is that B68, and then the 2005 just lets us know when it was published. And this order that we create is governed by the G100 worksheet in the CSM that's titled Filing Rules. So here, let's look at a shelf list visual so we can get a sense of how this works. We're looking at F614, which is for Minnesota local history. The G65 is a cutter that means Golden Valley, Minnesota. The G7 is a cutter that means Grand Portage, and G73, which we see down at the bottom here, is for Grand Rapids, Minnesota. So if we have a bunch of books on Grand Portage, what we want to do is we want to arrange them under that class number, F614.G7, in alphabetical order. And that alphabetical order is usually going to be filing by the main entry, which in most cases is going to be a personal name. So I've underlined in the title side on the right the parts that equate to the cutters that you see underlined, so you can see how these things work. So we have Arnold as A7, we have Buck as B9, we have Gilman as G55, Thompson as T5. So that's how we arrange these things. So now, let's say we have a new book, two new books that we want to add to this collection. We have John Arnold's Grand Portage's Trade History, so a different book by the same author that we have up here, published in 1932. And then we have a new work here by Hannah Holman, The Educational Aspects of the Grand Portage Historical Site, published in 2016. So what you do when you are classifying something is, first you're going to know that it's F614.G7 because you've looked this up and found out that the class number for Grand Portage, Minnesota is that particular class number. And then you look in your shelf list and say, where would this fit? So Grand Portage's Trade History by John Arnold, published in 1932, is going to need to file before a story of Grand Portage because Arnold is the same, so we need to go to our next level and then arrange things alphabetically by title. So G clearly comes before the S in story. So we're going to need to put Arnold ahead of that A7 cutter for the Grand Portage's Trade History. And then Hannah Holman is going to be a little easier. We don't have any H's in our shelf list here. So what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to follow the cutter table and create a cutter for Holman with what we see there. So let's talk now about the cutter table. So all the cutter table is doing is it's converting words into alphanumeric codes. And this is the means by which cutter achieves his perfect alphabetic order. So there are 5 rows in the table. In this little snapshot, we're seeing only 2, and we'll see the rest in the next slide. But for visualization purposes of how this works, we're just going to look at these 2 here. So the first row is for initial vowels, if the word you're cuttering starts with a vowel. The second row is if your word starts with the letter S. The third is for letters that start with QU, and then there's a separate entry for QA and QT, which we'll talk about later. And then the fourth row is for words that start with other initial consonants, so not S or Q, but any other consonant. And the last row is something that we use for all cutters when we are creating them, is this for expansion row. And what that does is it allows us to go out to 2 numbers. So if you're looking at a shelf list, of course, we're going to see things from across a long period of time, from early days of cataloging with LC classification. And so in the early days, a cutter may have only had 1 letter and 1 number. But the way that we do things now is at a minimum, we have 1 letter and 2 numbers. And then when we need to squish things in between, existing cutters will go out 2, 3, or 4 more numbers, as our spine labels and such will permit. So that's what we use the for expansion for. So what I've done here is I've taken my last name and hopefully color coded it in a way that is helpful. So B is an initial consonant, and so I'm looking to use the cutter table for for letters that occur after an other initial consonant, right? So B is not S or Q, so it's an other. And I look at the second letter O in the name, and I equate that for the second letter O. I use the number 6. So I get B6 as the start of my cutter. And then I go back to the name and I look at the third letter for expansion, and that's a T. And I look on the table there and I see the range T to V uses the number 8. And so I arrive at a cutter number of B68 for my name. And in all the years I've done this, this is the first time I've ever noticed that for expansion says for the second letter. And it really should not say that, because that's not how we use it. So if you've got that question, I don't know how to fix that. That is a Library of Congress issue. We use it for the third, fourth, fifth, etc. letters in a word. So here we have the full table to look at. So you can see after the initial vowel, for the second letter, we start with the letter B, which most of the time a word that starts with a vowel is not going to be followed by another vowel, but it happens, so we'll talk about that in a second. We've got after initial letter S, QU, and here's the little line for the initial letters QA and QT, and then the fourth and fifth row that we just saw and talked about. So if we want to cutter, for example, the word aardvark, A is an initial vowel. We look at our table here and we say the second letter is A, and it's not in this table here for us to look at. That's okay, because this table is not a rule. It's not something that is like this strict straitjacket that you've got to conform to completely. It's a guide. That's all it is. It's a place to put you in the zone that you want to be in for the best arrangement alphabetically, so you can adjust these things. So if you have aardvark, the initial letter is A, the second letter is A. There's no A on the table, but you can consider the B to be, you can consider that B to be a range of A and B and use the number 2, and that's how you get A27. So a couple of slides later, we're going to see something called Don't Box Me In. The 2 is the lowest number that we can use in a cutter number. So if you were to do A27 and you get another aardvark or something under Aaron, 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 or something like that, you may box yourself in. You may not have any room to move around. So one of the things that you can do is you can start with A2 and then go as the very beginning of that range, and then cutter for the A, the second A in aardvark, and the R in aardvark, and that's where you get your 27. So all that's doing is giving you some room to expand because you can put another number between those two 2s, or you can change the second 2 to a 3, so you've got some room to move. And that's the key here, is you want to keep room to move around. So if we were to cutter for Abbott, we would get the, there's my mouse, there we get the 2 for the B, and then we go down to for expansion, and the second B will be a 3 from right here. Smith, because it starts with an S, they arranged it a little differently because of the different consonant blends that we get with the S. M falls under this 6 right here, so we get a 6 as the second letter, and then we move down, and here we have the 5 for the I. Names that start with Mac, so I use McElroy as an example here, and we've got one spelling that's MC and another that is MAC. So this is an important thing to remember, that before 1981, names like this, either M, MC, or MAC, were all interfiled as if they were all spelled MAC. So regardless of what the letters were, we treated them as MAC. And so you will see older things in the shelf list following that convention. Those are okay. They were okay at the time, so they don't need to be changed, but that might trip you up when you see it the first time. So just keep that in mind. From 1982 onward, we do these strictly alphabetical. So McElroy MCE will come out as M34, and McElroy MAC will come out as M33. So we'll have this MAC McElroy filing before the MC McElroy, if that makes sense. And then a question that often comes up, what if the letter isn't in the table, isn't in the range? So here we've got the name Bharat, BH. And when you go for the initial consonants, you can see that the letter H is not in here. But what you want to do is treat these boxes as if they were ranges. So the number 3 here covers all the letters from A up to, but not including, the letter E. And then the E includes all letters from E up to, but not including, the letter I. So you can treat it that way as a range, and that will allow you to choose the right letter number combination. All right, so let's talk more specifically. The cutter numbers worksheet in the CSM is, the number is G63. So it's an easy thing to print out. If you do print it out, just a word of caution, there is a list of examples on the second page or the bottom of the first page where they show you examples of how things are cuttered. And if you look at that and compare it to the cutter table, you're going to find some things that don't match with the cutter table. That's because those examples are coming out of the LC shelf list and were adjusted to fit into that shelf list. So they're showing you what things can look like. They're not showing you necessarily how things should be strictly according to that cutter table. And the cutter table has also been updated over time. So some of these number ranges, I think 30 years ago, were slightly different than they are today. So that may also account for some differences that you may see. Again, the table is just there as a guide. It's not something that you need to follow super strictly. So how do you identify what it is that you need to use to create your cutter number? What you want is what we now call the preferred entry element, aka the main entry. And so some easy tips for doing this is, if you're using Mark, you can look for the 1XX field. So the 1XX field in your bibliographic record is what you would typically use to cutter your in that particular class number. If there is no 1XX present, then you're going to use the title that you have in the 245 subfield A. In AACR2 terms, you would follow the choice of main entry instructions, and then whatever you choose as your main entry term, that's the term that you would use for your cutter. Similarly, in RDA, you would use the first term that is part of the construction of the preferred access point. So 6.27 RDA will give you those instructions. When you construct the preferred access point for that particular work and manifestation, then you use the first term in that string as your source for what you're going to cutter. So once you've done that, you decide on what your class number is going to be, or you may already know what it is, and then you open up your catalog and you look at browse your call numbers, and that's looking at your shelf list. And so you find that spot that you need to put this book into that shelf list, and that's when you would make a decision as to whether you can follow the cutter table because there's no conflict there, or if you will have to construct your own call number, cutter number to be able to make this work. So some questions that you would ask yourself as you do this, just to restate it in a different way. Can your new resource file in the identified filing position with a cutter constructed by the table? That's the question you're asking yourself. If yes, just do it. Make it so you're good to go and move on to the next thing. If no, then what you want to do is locate the cutter ahead of and after the point where your new resource would file and construct a cutter that would fit between them. So that's all you're going to do. And the easiest way to do that, so here's our example that we were looking at a little bit earlier. We've got this book that we're adding, Hannah Holman, The Educational Aspects of the Grand Portage Historical Site. We know what our shelf list is showing us, F614.G7, and there are no H's in that shelf list at all. So we can easily follow the cutter table. The cutter table works. We use that to create H65 for Holman, and that's where it files, and we're good to go. But Arnold, as we can see, isn't going to work for us here. So what we had was A7 existing, and then we're adding this Grand Portage's trade history here, and it needs to file above that. So it needs to file between this Golden Valley and this earlier Arnold work. If we follow the cutter table, we're going to get a 76. So the cutter table would have us filing this book after a story of Grand Portage and vicinity, and that's not alphabetical. So that's not something that we want to do. To keep it alphabetical, we want to stay in this ideal green zone here. So we're going to take the A7 and we're going to go up a number, A6, and A65 is a good way to allow yourself some elbow room for other works by Arnold, because clearly he likes to write about Grand Portage. So some cutter adjustment tips for you. Never use the numbers 0 or 1. They look like the letters O and I, and that's why we don't use them. Avoid using the number 2 when expanding. The only time we would use the number 2 is when it is given to us in the cutter table itself, or when there's absolutely no other option for us to use it. But you don't want to add it on to the end of anything, because again, the 2 is the lowest that you can get. So you box yourself in if you use that. You can't go any lower, which is why we don't use the 2. So some tricks for expansion that you might want to keep in mind. So let's say you've got a shelf list that you're looking at, and the cutters that you need to insert in between are C36 and C37. And so what you can do is, when you're getting into these tighter shelf lists, something that I call split the difference. And if you use the number 5 whenever you can, you make a nice middle that will split the 36 and the 37 such that your book can fit into that shelf list, and you still have some room between C36 and C365 to put a wide range of books in there. So you don't want to go 363 because then you don't really have anywhere else to go. You want to use something like 5 to kind of go into the middle. So 5 is a nice magic number that helps. So here's an example. This is a real life example that I was just working on with our graduate assistant. Don't box me in. So this is coming out of the LC classification itself from 19th century literature schedule here. And as you can see, we have a C2 cutter assigned to Richard Carey, and we have a C38 assigned to Lydia Hinman. And we have this book by Alice Carey, and there's no place for us to create a cutter for Alice because Richard is taking up the only one available that would allow us to do an alphabetical order, because we can't use the number 1, we can't get in front of that C2. So Alice is boxed out, so is Fred, so is Gertrude, so is every other Carey that writes something in that time period that would use the PS 1268 number and whose name starts something before Richard. Even all of the Richards whose middle names come before the letter L are boxed out. So always think about that. And this is why that 5 is a really nice thing to do to save yourself from that. Let's talk briefly about cutter numbers for numerals. So sometimes things start with a number, and that's the element that you need to cutter with. And when you're cuttering with a numeral, the filing rules tell us that Arabic numerals file before Roman numerals, and those file before Latin letters. So what we do is we just construct some cutter number using a range between .A12 and .A19. So when presented with this, people who are learning it tend to get a little freaked out about it because there's no guidance here, but you're just picking a number that will work. And the thing to keep in mind is there aren't that many works out there that you're going to need to file by number. So usually what you pick is not going to be that hard to work with. So for example, if you are trying to cutter the number 0, it might be .A123. And this allows you some room for other works that might start with 0 because you have that whole range between A12 and A12999. So you've got a really big range of numbers that you can use to fit something ahead of this particular 0. You might use A15 for 9 because the 5 there is kind of in the middle of this A12 and A19. The Roman 9 might be A155. That makes it file after the Arabic. 1701 might be A184. So there's no real trick to this other than looking contextually at the shelf list that you have and making some decisions about that, and just taking a moment to think about, is this an area where they're going to use numbers a lot that you would need to file with, or is it just kind of a fluke? So if we look at the cutter numbers for QA to QT, it's the same type of thing. We're instructed to use the numbers between 2 and 29 as our first number. So if we look at, I took some examples here from the LC catalog of different names that start with QA, QE, etc. And you would really only run into trouble if you have a collection of works on lots of different topics that are all written in Arabic, and you use a transliterated system because the Arabic names are where you're usually going to find the most common examples of letters or names that start with Q, where the second letter is something other than U, which is the norm in the English language. So that's something to keep in mind. So let's walk through a quick example of shelf listing here. So the first, you get this book, 100 Years of Fashion. You're going to need to file it under the number 100. It's the first book that you've got in this class number, so we're going to use TT515. You can look at this and probably guess that 100 years of X is going to be a fairly popular type of title to use. So you might want to think carefully about the cutter that you use to allow some room. So I went with A15 just to pick a number, and it allows room on either side. So a couple years later, we've got our 100 Years of Fashion, but we get these two other books, 100 Years of Fashion, 20th Century in Pictures, and 100 Years of Fashion Illustration. So we're filing these also under the word or the number 100, and the publication date is also a filing element when you need it, so keep that in mind. And we would use that for different publication dates of the same work or different editions. So 100 Years of Fashion, 2009, we're going to want this to file before the 2012, and that's where we get this A145, so that it comes up between there, and we still have plenty of room here. And then A156, we've still got plenty of room here. We've got the numbers 3, 4, and 5 that we can use to insert something between these second two titles. So it's usually contextual when you're dealing with this, looking at the range and seeing what you have to work with. Now let's talk a moment about reserved cutters. You've probably seen this on occasion when you look at some lists, like the periodicals will have A1, Congresses A15, directories A2, and then your general works, they give you this A3 to Z range here. What's going on is that A1 is being reserved for all periodicals and societies in that particular class number. So that's where they will be. And then you would cutter them by whatever your main entry happens to be. Congresses at A15, and then you cutter by those. What's a little sneaky here is that for the general works, the first cutter that you might be able to use is going to be A3. So if you're cuttering for aardvark, you can't do A227. You would have to do A3 because that's the first one that's allowed for a general work. But it's not actually part of the class number itself. This cutter right here is going to end up in your subfield B. So it's a slightly different thing to keep in mind. Sometimes you're going to apply cutter numbers from a list, and this comes into play when you're dealing with geographic places. So when you find by region or state or other regions or countries, A to Z, then what you're going to do is you're going to go to the Classification and Shelflisting Manual, CSM G302 table for your states and Canadian provinces, and the G300 table for regions and countries. And you would use the predefined cutter for those particular geographic places where you see this A to Z right there, and those things together are your class number. All right. Every now and then you're going to see this .x2 to A. So you'll see some sort of arrangement like this, .A to Z, .x2A to .x to Z, .A3 to Z, where the 3 might be any number that is 3 or later. So these are indications that you have to construct the cutter number a certain way. When you see the .x, it's just a placeholder for the class number that you have up until that point. And then you would just append the numeral 2, and then you would create a cutter for the next piece of it. And then to wrap some things up, the Library of Congress classification likes to use alphabetical arrangement for special lists. So for special topics and such, you will find a mixture of 2- and 1-letter cutters. And as you can see from this list, they apply to specific services and departments in this particular case. So they're usually some sort of special topic, and they'll have a cutter made for them. So often when you see a long list of these, that is basically a closed list. And if you have some sort of new special topic, you would just need to use the general works number. And if you really need a new cutter, go ahead and propose it through the SACO proposal system. I think the Library of Congress frowns on you constructing your own special cutter in these particular ranges. However, sometimes you find really short, little, less developed lists, like we see here for analysis and synthesis. Now, this is a tricky area because it may be that you don't have anything else for the special topics for carbohydrates that could actually work in here, and so this is a complete list. On the other hand, it may be an undeveloped list, so you would need to have some good disciplinary knowledge of this to be able to know whether this is an undeveloped list where they've just thrown in a few for example purposes and then you can make your own, or if this is it, because that's basically all that we have for this particular topic, and you wouldn't actually ever create anything else for it. So you've got to have some discipline-specific expertise to do that. But in these really short lists, a classifier might be justified in certain cases, and you would just need to determine, when those are, based on what you're looking at, that you need to make a specialized cutter. And anytime that you need to do that, it's always wise to see if you can do that through the proposal system. So if any of you are PCC members, particularly NACO members, you would have access to that proposal system in Classification Web, and so you could do it there, or you can find on the PCC site some SACO members and ask them to submit one for you. And with that, it's time for questions.
Okay, just as a reminder, if you have questions for Bobby, please type it into the questions box on your screen. So going back to slide 15, what if you have another John B. Arnold, a different person but same subject?
A different person but the same subject. So if it's a different person, then the authorized access point for that name would have some addition that would make it different. It might be their date, it might be a fuller form of their name, and those would also be filing elements. So if you've got a John B. Arnold and there's some addition to it, alphabetically they would have to file after this last one that exists here that has nothing added to the name. So the access point itself is part of the filing element.
So even though that's further along in the name, you just have to take that into account and make sure they all fall after.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Another question. I've seen cutters with and without a decimal before it. Is one more correct?
Okay. And we've got an example right here. So the first cutter here has a decimal and the second does not. And the way that LC classification works is that the first cutter, it doesn't matter where it lives in the call number itself, but the first cutter has a decimal. If you have a second cutter, it does not have a decimal. I don't know why that is. I've never been able to find an answer. That's just the way that it is. So first cutter decimal, second cutter never.
Okay. Are we still on slide 15?
Yes.
Okay. Where does the G7 part of the classification come from? Not the cutter table. So does it come from the LC call number classification table?
Yes, so the F614.G7, the G7 is a type of cutter. It's an editorially constructed cutter. So F614 is for local history. If you go into the Fs, each state has their own little number, and it's divided up into general and then counties and then cities. And then the cities are arranged alphabetically by using a cutter system where the cutter has been editorially constructed to make them all fit. So G7 simply means Grand Portage. It loosely follows what you would see in the cutter table, but somebody has constructed this for all of the major cities that are in the state. So
okay.
Part of the class number.
How do you cutter for a spelled out number? For example, 100 years of fashion, but 100 is spelled out, or under German title 100. Should it be under O and H?
Exactly. So you don't worry about the what you're looking at is what the characters are. So if the characters are Arabic, then you're going to follow the numeral system. If the characters are Latin, you're going to use this table. So it doesn't matter if the word is a number. If it's 1 or 100, you're going to use after the initial vowel O, and then you would have a 5 for the N, and then a 4 for the E. So you would get 054 for the word 1. But for the numeral 1, you would, wherever I put those, oh, here they are. For the numeral 1, you would use this construction right here.
Okay, on this slide here, why wouldn't your example of 1701 come before the Roman numeral 9?
So these are just examples. They're not meant to be in filing order. It's just you are picking something that works in the context of the shelf list that you have.
Okay. Another question, why do you create a second cutter?
We create a second cutter because sometimes the class number, like we see here, already has a cutter in it. So when you have a periodical on nursing homes, the class number is RA997.A1. And let's say you have 5 different periodicals on nursing homes, you would need to arrange them alphabetically within that class number, and we would do that using the main entry and a cutter for that main entry. So that's where the second cutter comes from. Similarly, if you're doing that, arranging things by region or state or country, the first cutter is going to represent that geographic space, and then the second cutter is arranging alphabetically by that main entry within that particular class number that represents the geographic place.
Okay, thank you. Someone says, I see many DLC records with only classification numbers, but without providing cutter numbers. Do you know if this is a general practice by LC?
So it would depend upon what they are. If they are serials, then they may, usually they're going to have a cutter at least, but they won't have a year. There are a lot of records for ebooks that may only have a class number. So for electronic resources, people go back and forth on whether it should have a full call number or just the class number, because we don't need a call number because there's no shelf space being occupied, for example. So it kind of depends on your needs. It may be that it's a very brief record, like a CIP record, and only the class number has been assigned at that point. So there could be a lot of different reasons, but something that is fully cataloged should have a full call number in it.
Okay, in cataloging fiction, usually a single author will have a single first cutter for their name that is the same, and individual titles are shelf listed by a second cutter for the title. Why is that not the case for other types of work, such as the Arnold examples?
Oh, great question. So it's all about what the class number means. So for, let's see, where did Arnold go? Okay, so for here, this is a literary author number, PS1268.C2 for the author Richard L. Carey. So everything that he wrote will be under that class number, and then we don't need to arrange by him because that would be redundant. We would arrange by title, right? We want everything that he wrote to be arranged by title because that class number equates to his name. When we're looking at Arnold or Holman or somebody, we're looking at a class number that represents a topic. So this topic here is the history of Grand Portage, Minnesota. So there are many different authors that might write on Grand Portage, and that's what we see in this shelf list here. So the arrangement here is by the author's last name, because the class number means Grand Portage. It does not mean the author themselves.
Okay, if you are unsure of the publication date, would you still enter it in brackets? Also, sometimes I see a date with a B at the end or a U, like 1980B. What does this mean?
Okay, so in your publication information field 260 or 264, you may have a date that has a question mark, or you may have brackets around it. We do not use those in the call number. You would just use the date that's there. So if you have like 19 question mark because you know it's 19th century and that's it, you would use 1900 and then the lowercase z at the end to indicate that it's questionable. The lowercase letters that you see at the end of some call numbers are what are called work letters, and the A is, I believe, assumed, if I remember right. The B means that this is the second manifestation by a different publisher of this exact same work published in the exact same year that's come across your desk. So it would use the same class number and cutter number because it's the same work. It's published in the same year, but they're different publishers, and so you would add a letter at the end, B and then C and then D, as they come across your desk. So in receipt order, that's all that's happening there.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we have time for. There are still some questions left. If you have any more questions, go ahead and put them into the questions box, and Bobby will answer them offline and send them to everybody. So thank you, Bobby, for that very interesting presentation on LC cutter numbers. I think we all learned something from that. Thank you to all our attendees. We hope you found today's session useful. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form along with links to today's recording and slides. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. Your comments are very valuable and help the ALCTS committee improve its webinars and help plan future events. ALCTS now offers certificates of attendance to webinar participants. More information on this will be included in the email you receive. Information about all ALCTS webinars can be found on the ALCTS homepage. Please check out our web courses and upcoming e-forums as well. Suggestions for webinars and other CE opportunities are welcome at any time. You can contact any member of the ALCTS CE committee or submit a proposal for a webinar using the online form on the ALCTS webpage under Online Learning. I would like to thank Mary Aycock and Julia Hess for providing technical support for today's webinar. The support they and their colleagues on the Technical Support Subcommittee provide make it possible for us to present these webinars smoothly. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you will participate in other ALCTS CE events again in the future.